Hello, class of '88 classmates. Paul Mange Johansen here. Happy 35th reunion. I am enjoying seeing you all, I believe, at the moment. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about my passion for photography. I'm going to try and keep it kind of brief. I should have materials in other locations as well, both the in-person gallery and the virtual gallery. But it has always been a serious sideline of mine, I would say, more so at some times than others, and has played an important role in my life. So I appreciate the opportunity to think about its role in my life and share that with you. So my first camera I got for Christmas, 1975. I think this is the first photo I ever took on a camera. Christmas 1975. That is my sister and mother and her parents, my grandparents, in front of the Christmas tree. That would have been a month before my 10th birthday. Photography has always, as I said, been important. It took on, I would say, a more serious role in my life. I always have had a camera nearby and have always taken pictures. Part of the reason I think I'm so drawn to photography, which is incredibly versatile, is that my memory is not great. And so partly I record experiences as a way to remember them, which is a whole separate topic. As an example of how that may have gotten me into trouble on occasion, it has gotten me into trouble on occasion. I'll mention a very quick story. I was traveling in Ireland with my now ex-wife, and we were traveling with friends, and we stopped at a lovely field to look at a lovely rainbow, and over a lovely hill, green, green, green everywhere, except for the sky and the rainbow. But it wasn't the right angle that I needed for the photograph, so I ran maybe halfway across this field to get the correct angle. And when I came back, my now ex-wife was not very happy with me, and the quote that she said that we used for years after that, and I still use, is, "This is not a fucking photo safari." To which my internal response was, of course it's a fucking photo safari. Life is a fucking photo safari. And that's not the only reason, but that is perhaps one reason. She is now an ex-wife of mine. We didn't see eye to eye on that issue, as well as some others. But let me go to a moment in time which holds some importance in my photography life, and that is July 22nd, 1991. I was a medical student at UMass in Worcester and was doing psychiatry research at the time in a gorgeous, old, historic, massive psychiatry facility, institution, which when it was founded in the 1870s, I think 1873, was called the Asylum for the Chronic Insane. It's now called Worcester State Hospital. Actually, it's not called anything now for reasons you'll see. And I was doing research, had a research office, but it was an abandoned building. And so I spent my lunch hours photographing it for months, I think. And one day I went home for lunch, and as I was driving back to the office, I saw smoke billowing on the skyline of Worcester. And I thought, as I usually, not surprisingly, would under those circumstances, I'm not going right back to the office. I'm going to see where all the smoke is coming from. And it turned out the smoke was coming from my office, quite literally. It was a 6-alarm fire. There was an issue with water pressure. It sits on the top of a hill. Had a huge clock tower that still exists, thankfully. Not quite in the same form. that firemen had the foresight to preserve. Um, and long story short, the entire hospital, minus the clock tower portion, the entryway, iconic visually, was destroyed. And what that did for me personally was I had already been obsessed with this building, and I felt it was important to document it in some way, given that I presumably had the last existing fairly extensive series of photographs of this historic building. So I teamed up with classmate and elementary school friend Max Page, Trumbull College, and we put together an exhibit which we called Passages, Portraits of Worcester State Hospital, which showed in a number of places, first at the medical center, because it was a medical center facility building, they owned it, even if they didn't operate it. That sort of sent me in a different direction. Again, wasn't the only reason, but I would say it was a contributing factor to my dropping out of med school. Here's a photograph I took of the demolition process when they were tearing down the building. It's a whole other topic I could go on and on and on about, but I will try not to. From there, we actually had a second exhibit focused on the top 10 most endangered properties in Worcester, which was fun. But then we had another fairly major exhibit. I went on after med school to work for about 2.5 years at Mass General Hospital in Boston. And interestingly at the time, because Boston, as you probably know, is so tight and real estate is at a premium, the hospital literally sits next to a jail, historic jail, Charles Street Jail, which they owned. They bought it. It was abandoned. And I asked permission to go inside and photograph it using some of it as justification. That's what I do. I photograph old buildings, particularly decrepit ones, particularly institutions that people would prefer not to think much about. That's kind of my shtick. And on a Friday afternoon was handed a skeleton key by the person who was the keeper of the skeleton key, and he said, "Give it back to me on Monday." And I believe I was the last person for whom that happened, because as soon as I'm sure his bosses found out about it, they stopped that policy. But so I was in Boston at the time and had access to the Charles Street Jail. Max at the time was in grad school at UPenn, and there is a similar, these are both historic architecturally buildings and institutions. In Philadelphia there's the Eastern State Penitentiary, which you may have visited, and if you haven't, you should. It's really incredible. And so we also got access to that. We took a bunch of photographs. We were among some of the last people to be able to go in the main clock tower and take photographs. You can see the skyline of Philadelphia from the clock tower, but it was fairly rickety, and I'm sure, again, as somebody discovered that there were people up there, they said, yeah, we shouldn't do that for liability reasons. So we turned that into a photo exhibit, which we called Forms of Punishment, which we had at the Eastern State Penitentiary, as well as at Massachusetts State House. And that was that. Here are a couple of my photographs, and two of mine, one of Max's, that I especially like and are sort of iconic. This is peeling paint on a jail cell wall of a calendar. This happens to be August. I don't know what year. I believe the city shut down the jail as a functioning jail in the 70s, thanks, I think, to a lawsuit brought by inmates. Here's another photograph of a calendar on a jail cell wall. This is actually paint. It looks like fabric. It is paint that has peeled off the wall. And on the back of that paint is another calendar that inmates had written, marking time, because there isn't much else to do when you're in jail. Those are from Charles Street Jail in Boston. This is from Eastern State. These, which pioneered solitary confinement until Charles Dickens wrote about the effect it had on people's psyches, and they decided might not be a good idea. Very typical jail cell in Eastern State. Very small, sort of skylights there. We happen to name this image Absolute Confinement for obvious reasons. Looks like a vodka bottle. And then from there, I branched off on my own. I have still maintained from my Yale days a passion for the history of Hansen's disease, otherwise known as leprosy. It's a passion that started my senior year of Yale, taking a medical history course with John Harley Warner. I currently have an exhibit up on Penikese Island leprosarium, although we don't use that term anymore, on Penikese Island in Buzzards Bay between Martha's Vineyard and New Bedford. Again, fascinating history. I visited Carville, Louisiana, which was a patient-run, a national facility for patients with Hansen's disease. So I took these photographs on a trip while I was still a student, medical student, put together an exhibit on that. I've been to Kalaupapa on Hawaii, and it was early enough, in the mid-90s I think, there were still some patients living there who I interviewed. That's Carville. That's Richard Marks, who's a colorful character in Hawaii. This is a tour. Again, happy to spend a whole lecture talking about that topic. Article that I wrote, my term paper for that course ended up as a cover story for New Jersey Medicine a few years later. Nowadays, shouldn't say that, I do have an exhibit and have had a couple, mostly on Hansen's disease. These days, I mostly take pictures with my cell phone, which means my creative outlet is Facebook, for better or for worse. But there's one last point that I want to make about my passion for photography, and it has to do with its flexibility, both in terms of technique and in terms of subject matter. This is a photograph of paranitrophenol under birefringent polarized light that my grandfather took in 1979. So my grandfather, my father's father, was an amateur photographer. I'm sitting in front of a wall of photographs that my father took. Part of the reason I got into photography is I grew up with a father who would convert our bathroom, upstairs bathroom, into a darkroom twice a year. So I would hang out with him in the darkroom. His subjects were inanimate generally. He was a genetics professor at UMass Amherst, and so would take a lot of nature photographs, generally not of people. He also had a interesting, and has still, an interesting passion for gravestones, so he has a lot of very interesting gravestone photographs. This is Trondheim, Norway, spools of something or other. This is Sanibel Island, 1994. Norway, 2008. If you could scroll up, you would see Bergen, Norway, 1963, before I was born. These are some train tracks, ferns growing in train tracks in Shelburne Falls, not too far from where I'm videotaping you and videotaping from in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. So I'm a third generation photographer, and I'm proud to say there's fourth generation. This is a magazine that my stepson put together called Work, with a U umlaut. He is based in Atlanta. and uses photography mostly to photograph rap musicians, and he did all the layout for this magazine. That's the back cover. And a friend of his from high school did all the writing for that magazine. It's on Instagram. If you're interested, they're working on a second issue right now. So in addition to being a creative outlet, is also a way of connecting generations, which I think is pretty special. The last thing I'll add is my biggest regret, maybe one of my regrets anyway, of my Yale undergraduate career is that I never got into Tom Roma's photography class. Max did, and his photographs are better than mine. Whether that's the reason, it is a potential reason, but had I gotten into that class, maybe photography wouldn't have been a sideline, but we'll never know. So thanks for listening, and feel free to look at my work in the in-person gallery and online. Enjoy reunion.